All right, very good. Well, thank you very much. And this is, these are unusual times in a lot of ways, and so this is actually the first virtual field day that I've taken part in. But I know that the research stations eh, for this summer, every field day they have is scheduled to be a virtual field day like this, and so it's a format that's unusual to us, but I think also a format that has some advantages because we can show things and talk about things maybe across even a wider geography than we would be able to if we were just in one location. So thank you everybody for joining, and on behalf of Commissioner Troxer and the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, we appreciate everybody that's involved in the pollinator program. It's something that the research stations have been fairly heavily involved in for several years now. And I remember when that program on the research stations got started, and I was serving then as director of the research stations. We we had to learn a lot about what we were doing, for one thing, and got a lot of pollinator plots established across the research stations. And one of the most exciting things that came out of that, I think, is when you look at the data that were collected across all of those stations, and you look at the tremendous diversity in pollinators that we have in North Carolina. We talk a lot of times about agriculture being agriculture in North Carolina being one of the most diverse in the country, and that is certainly true. But I don't think any of us, at least I sure didn't, have any clue what kind of diversity we'd see of the pollinator species that were visiting those pollinator plots on the stations. And so it served a very good research objective, and it's also served, I think just as importantly, an awareness objective of how important pollinators and host plants, the correct host species, and those kind of things can be in any landscape, and particularly in an agricultural landscape. And it's well documented and well known the contribution that pollinators make to our food production systems, and so they are receiving the attention, I guess you'd say, that they've deserved for quite some time. So I'd like to thank Kelly Snyder in particular for his work with research stations and leading that program now for several years. Done some fine work along with a lot of other folks. It's been a great partnership with the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance, with several of the major basic manufacturers in agriculture. It's been a good partnership with NC State and in many respects. And so it's good to see these kind of things come together. A lot of times when you start a program, you don't really know, you're not sure how far things are going to go, but this one has gone quite a ways, and I think we've got quite a ways to go. So thank you all for being part of this, and for taking part in this program. And again, on behalf of Commissioner Troxer and Department of Ag, I'd like to welcome you to this Pollinator Field Day. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Sandy. We appreciate you introducing our field day. So my name is Gabriella Garrison, and I'm a biologist for the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and I'm also one of the lead partners for the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. And if you're not familiar with our organization, we're a growing partnership representing more than 25 conservation organizations across the state, including state and federal and local governments, NGOs, and private entities. So we were brought together by a very common interest: pollinator conservation, habitat conservation, and outreach. And so on that note, we're really excited that all of you took the time to be here today. For the past 2 years, we've had this Pollinator Field Day at our research stations, like Sandy had mentioned. The first year we had it in Salisbury at the Piedmont Research Station. Last year we had it in Raleigh at Lake Wheeler, and this year we were planning on having it at the Cunningham Research Station in Kinston, but because of current circumstances, we decided that it wouldn't be safe to have a large crowd. So we wanted to go virtual so that we could still bring you all of this great information from the comfort of your own home. And we wanted to kick off National Pollinator Week 2020, which today is the first day. So there are 18 research stations across the state, and all of the research stations have done a lot of work to implement pollinator plots where they are. And so our first speaker, Matthew Daughtry with NCDA, he's going to be talking to you about some of the pollinator plots that we put in at Cunningham. Because there was so much work that was put in for this field day, we wanted to make sure that people got to see it and it got the attention that it deserved. Hopefully next year, we'll be able to have our face-to-face event where people can get in the field, and instead of listening to these presentations through PowerPoint, you can actually get on the ground and see what's going on. But in the meantime, we're here today with a lot of really great speakers who have some good presentations lined up for you. And let's look at the agenda. See if I can fast forward this slide. All right. So we're going to start with some presentations about pollinator habitat creation, restoration, and enhancement. And I'll mention this again a little later, but we're going to have about 20 minutes for each presentation, and then we're going to have a 10-minute segment for Q&A. So if you have questions while the presentation is going through, please put them in the chat box, and we'll try to answer them to the best that we can. So we're going to start with habitat creation. Then we're going to do native bee field collection and identification. Then we're going to go to native bee life cycles, and then we're going to end with pesticide stewardship. So this is our list of speakers for today. Like I said, we're starting with Matthew Daughtry. We're going to have then John Eisenhower to talk more about some pollinator habitat enhancement and creation. Then we're going to go to Hannah Levinson, then Dr. Elsa Youngstadt, and then we're going to end with Sydney Ross. And just a little bit of basic housekeeping, all your microphones and cameras have been turned off. So just to make it a little bit easier for everybody to see and to hear the speakers, if you can keep them turned off, that would be great. Like I said, each segment will last about 20 minutes, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask your questions through the chat box. And we'll give each speaker about 10 minutes. And then I think what we're going to do at the end of everything, if there are a lot of questions that we still weren't able to answer, we're going to compile them all. And then in a few weeks, we'll send them out in an email so that you can get your answers that way. I'm going to have the contact information for each speaker posted at the end of all 4 segments. Then we're going to record this, it's recording right now, and we're going to upload it to our website, ncpollinatoralliance.org, as well as put it on YouTube. And that's probably going to be about 2 or 3 weeks when we'll do that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started with introducing our first speaker, Matthew Daughtry. He's a research specialist for the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services at the Caswell-Cunningham Research Station. And his talk was pre-recorded because we wanted to make sure that we could get some good footage of the pollinator plots with decent weather. We weren't sure how today was going to turn out, but he is going to be available during the Q&A session for any questions that you might have. And he was pretty monumental in putting in those plots and maintaining them and keeping them going and ready to go for our field day, which was supposed to be this last Saturday. So Matt, if you want to take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Matthew Daughtry, Research Specialist with the Caswell-Cunningham Research Farm. Today I'm going to be talking about our pollinator plot located at the Cunningham Research Station. A little background information on Cunningham Research Station. The station was established in 1987. It consists of 252 acres of cropland, 111 acres of woodland, and 16 acres of ponds. The pollinator plot for the 2020 field day is a pre-existing pollinator habitat. It is located on sandy loam soil, and the acreage consists of 3/4 of an acre. The soil report for the site has a pH of 5.8 and called for nitrogen and potash. The prior year, the habitat was predominantly grass, with a few blooms scattered about. This year, it was time for a renovation to restore the numbers and wildflowers. With the renovation in order, we had plans to accomplish 2 different planting dates, a fall planting and a spring planting. In the beginning of the renovation, we started with some tillage practices. We used a disc harrow as the primary tillage to chop up and mix residue into the soil. It took numerous passes, 3 to be exact, with the harrow until we were able to have suitable conditions for our field cultivator. The field cultivator is the secondary tillage practice, and what it does is break down remaining clods left by the disc harrow and smooth out the land. This helps in preparing a sufficient seedbed for when we come and plant our plots. After the tillage practices were complete, we then applied 200 pounds of 10-10-20 fertilizer on November 7th to the site with a pendulum spreader. Following the fertilizer application, we come back with the field cultivator and work our fertilizer into the soil. We began the fall planting on December 7th. Fall planting consisted of Plains Coreopsis, Pollinator mix, Fall planting mix, corn poppy, and burr marigold. For the planter, we used a 12-foot no-till drill, modified to 10-foot. The idea behind this modification was to have 1-foot blank alleys in the plot as walkways for the field day and serve as application alleys with the 60-inch equipment located at the station. This only involved blocking the outside 6-inch units and 2 inside 6-inch units. On March 5th, we planted Monardo. This was our one winter planting wildflower. On March 17th, we began the spring planting. The spring planting consisted of spring mix, Plains Coreopsis, and pollinator mix. The rest of the plot's border was planted with a combination of pollinator and spring mix. On April 16th, we sprayed clethodim at the rate of 8 ounces to the acre, and a non-ionic surfactant was mixed with the chemistries at 1 pint per 50 gallons. The decision to spray clethodim was made after we had a major flush of emerging grasses brought on by warming temperatures. This was to be expected, especially with the site's history the previous year. In this picture, you can see the difference of with and without clethodim. This chemistry was a major tool for the success of this plot, and without it, grasses would have choked out the wildflowers. Finally, to wrap up the applications made to the site so far this year, we applied 300 pounds to the acre of 10-10-20 on May 15th. As I reflect upon how this pollinator habitat went this year, it is easy to notice that the fall planted wildflowers did not perform as well as to be expected. I believe this to be the cause of the planting date being too late in the season. By the time the wildflowers had emerged, the presence of winter weeds was becoming a competitor, and thus the vigor in the wildflowers was being tested all winter long. By the time spring rolled around, weeds were able to take hold in this area because of the lack of wildflower coverage. To alter this part in the pollinator habitat, the plans are to come out in early to middle fall and spray glyphosate in the fall planting area. After the chemistry takes hold in the vegetation, we will set the disc harrow to a shallower disking depth and fall behind with the drill. I believe if we get the wildflower vegetation out in front of the winter weed competition, we will have a better success for the fall planting. I would now like to take this time to thank the station staff that helped with this project throughout the season. Thank you for all that you do and continue to do. I would also like to thank Anthony Thomas at the Piedmont Research Station for your assistance. And last but not least, thank you to Lee County Extension Agent Minda Daughtry for providing a drone and plot footage as we maneuvered around this recent wet weather we have been having. Thank you.
right, great. Thank you, Matt. So in a continuation talking about pollinator habitat creation, we had a little bit of information about habitat on farms. Now we're going to move to private lands. So John Eisenhower has been a technical assistant biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission Private Lands Program for the past 14 years. As a technical assistant biologist, he provides landowners guidance to meet their wildlife objectives and helps to identify funding opportunities for habitat-oriented projects. He covers 33 counties in central North Carolina. So John, if you're ready, take it away.
All right, can you hear me, Gabriella?
I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Gabriella said, I am John Eisenhower, and I've been doing this job for about 14 or 15 years. And just to get started, I wanted to make sure to point out two things on this initial slide. Number one, the word in the title is enhancement, not restoration. I think that's a big difference and something on private lands that we really need to address a little differently. And secondly, there are no extra initials or titles after my name. So just know that this is based off my experience, not based on research, and nothing that I've done has been peer reviewed. So I have been assisting private landowners to manage property in the Piedmont, North Carolina with the Wildlife Commission for 14 or 15 years now. And most of what I get tied into is early successional vegetation management. And that has led to some establishment of native species. But while managing private lands, a lot of what you really come down to doing are managing landowners' expectations. On private lands, these are the folks that make the decisions on what they want done on their property, and we always try to address their objectives. And when dealing with pollinator habitat in particular, landowner expectations are very important, because this is what everyone envisions whenever you start talking about planting wildflowers for pollinators. And this could be possible with some annuals and non-native species. But for the most part, whenever you start integrating more species diversity and more native species, which often have lower germination rates and they're slower to bloom, expectations aren't always met. And of course, with the photo here, we know that it takes more than just a green thumb to have this kind of stand of wildflowers. It takes all kinds of green body parts and lots of luck and some magic. So what I wanted to do is talk about a project from a couple years ago that started working on in 2017. This is a Stanley County project, right over 20 acres, and it has been funded with USDA Farm Bill funds. This was a CRP, or Conservation Reserve Program contract and project. So just a little bit of history about the site. It was farmed intensively using Roundup Ready crops for a long period of time. 2017, the last crop that was harvested was soybeans. This grain cover crop was planted in December of 2017. And I took this photo just before we started terminating the cover crop on March 29th. So the first step of really converting this was to go ahead and do a herbicide application. This time of year, a lot of the winter annuals are fairly lush and absorbing herbicide very easily. So we applied 1/4 glyphosate per acre, between 4 and 5 ounces of imazapic per acre. We used methylated seed oil as a adjuvant. And treated the entire area. The glyphosate, of course, is a burn down, so it's killing what's growing actively. The imazapic provides about 60 days of pre-emergent control for a wide variety of species, especially cool season grasses as well as annual grasses such as crabgrass and foxtail. Then on April 21st, we planted the area using a specialized Truax seed drill. Truax drill is specially designed to plant some of the fluffy seeds. Some of the native grasses have very fluffy seed structure. So we utilize that to get a better seed to soil contact, better distribution of the seed. And you can see here from our planting list, we were shooting for about 4.5 pounds of grass per acre and 3.5 pounds of forbs per acre. Again, this was not necessarily a pollinator planting as much as a general overall wildlife enhancement planting. So just to go through a few slides here to see the progress of what happened over time. So we planted on the 11th of May, took several weeks here for things to get growing. About May 26th, came back. You start seeing some faint rows. June the 7th, things are starting to show up a little bit more. Already you can see the predominance of the native grasses in this mix. They're not dominating the stand, but they certainly are visible in the rows. Let's continue on, see a few more blooms on June 14th. Started to really see some color. The landowner was very happy with the results on June 22nd. A few more species popping up here, a few more blooms. July 8th. And a few more things popping up on July 13th and August 9th. So we went back through on September 7th and took a little more of an inventory of what we could find as far as a species standpoint. We had planted 19 species of forbs on this site, and as of September 7th, we had 12 of them germinate where we could identify them in the planting rows. We did pick up one more species later on in September when we found some New York ironweed had popped up and had actually bloomed as well. You can see on through the fall, certainly can see the structure of the native grasses has really turned on through the growing season and has begun to dominate the stand at the seeding rate that was kind of to be expected. And this is just an example of the species, the insect life that we identified during that first growing season. Had good visitation by different insects. And again, I think everyone was pleased with the results that first year. Back for just a second. One thing that we always have learning experiences whenever we do these projects on private lands, but going into the second year in the spring of 2019, there was some concern about agricultural weeds, sickle pod, pigweed, cockleburr, things such as that. And I made the decision to do a preemptive treatment with 3 ounces of Mazapic per acre. And that turned out to be a true learning experience, as probably would not do that again. It did ding up a lot of the forb component. One thing to think about as you're approaching a pollinator project is to think about the seed bank. Oftentimes you can get really good results without planting anything at all. especially in old pastures or areas that have been fallow for some time. This field, for example, was sprayed to kill the cool season fescue and has been burned every other year for the last 10 years. Lots of mountain mint, butterfly weed, common milkweed, and some other really beneficial pollinator species have shown up just by managing the seed bank alone. You really want to know what you have in the seed bank. If you can identify things that are starting to pop up and germinate, it always makes the landowner a little more comfortable managing the seed bank if there's some idea of what's there. There's always going to be surprises, good and bad, that kind of pop up out of the seed bank whenever you're managing fallow vegetation. And the other thing I think that's often overlooked are forested situations. You can see here the amount of acreage that we had in the fields on the Stanley County project site. Lots of landowners are not able to or are not willing to give up their production agriculture or pasture land. So you want to make sure to look for opportunities to improve pollinator habitat in forested situations as well. And just about any way you do it, a timber harvest always looks pretty destructive. Opening the canopy of a forest stand with heavy equipment does take some soil disturbance, and it's pretty shocking. But oftentimes it's required to be able to get a very good, diverse understory that can be beneficial for pollinators, not just a food source, but also overwintering habitat, of good diversity of host plants. So there again, looking on on field edges, road shoulders, anywhere that you can get sunlight on the forest floor, you can have a positive impact for pollinators. So kind of my last thoughts, I feel that we can enhance pollinator habitat on a large scale, but we have to keep a few things in mind. First of all, unless a landowner is very willing and has a lot of extra funding, it's probably going to be an enhancement of pollinator habitat and early successional habitat, not necessarily a restoration. When you start adding lots and lots of different species of seeds, cost really really increases quickly. And some of these seeds do take several years to actually show up once they're planted. You must have willing landowners. If you try to force a landowner into doing some of this stuff, it just, nobody ends up very happy with the outcome. Landowner expectations have to be realistic. We have to continue to test different species of commercially available seeds. For instance, the center of the Stanley County projects, you saw we did the perimeter of the fields in 2018. We came back this spring and planted this mixture on about 6 acres in the center of the fields. So we're trying different things to see what works on this scale of project, along with what will tolerate some of the herbicides that we need to use. And then finally, we really need to make sure that we keep funding sources available to offset the installation cost, as well as the foregone income that private landowners experience whenever they take part of their land out of production to develop pollinator habitat. With that, Gabrielle, I think I'm done.
All right, good deal. Thank you, John. So we have a few questions, and John, I think this first one, if you don't mind, I might ask this of you because I know you and I have had this conversation more than once over the last several years. So Devona wants to know, why is glyphosate being used when it's toxic to the environment?
Well, to be able to get these species established, a lot of these species are slow growing. The natives take a longer period of time to get a root system established. And with the kind of weed composition and competition that we have here in the Southeast, it's just very difficult to be able to get these species established without using using some broad spectrum herbicides. And for instance, the project I highlighted, that field had been sprayed repeatedly each year with a glyphosate product in order to develop or grow a crop. Whereas when the landowner decided to take it out of production, we used a very limited amount of glyphosate in the conversion process. So since that time in 2018, there's not been a broadcast spray of a glyphosate. There was one broadcast spray of a Mazapic, but I don't foresee any additional broad spectrum herbicides that will be applied on that property. So it's looking at the longer term management of the property. It's certainly limiting glyphosate use on the landscape by doing this conversion on this landowner's property.
And just to reiterate what John said, you know, the intent is certainly just to use it as sparingly as possible, with the knowledge that in the future it'll be used less and less, and possibly to the point of very minimal, if no use at all, just to give the natives a chance to get established. So we had another question, and this is for either Matthew or John. Why did you not limit your flower species to those native to the Southeast, especially those native to Caswell County?
Well, I'll talk about why we didn't limit the ones native to Stanley County on the project that I talked about. It really goes back to landowner expectations, as well as some program requirements for the funding. The Stanley County project, the landowner is foregoing roughly $100 a year in rental payments, more or less. They spent probably $500 to $600 an acre out of pocket, and people want to see something happen when they put forth that kind of effort and that kind of money. A lot of the species that are more locally native just do not perform well when planted. And also there are limited numbers of species that are available commercially. And as you get into some of the more localized species, the cost can go up extremely high very quickly. With some of the species, you know, $300 to $400 a pound, you know, is not uncommon for some of the local native species. So there, you know, private lands, we're trying to make sure that we can get the enhancement, not necessarily the restoration. And if you approach the landowner and said, we want to plant this seed and it may come up in 3 years, you won't see anything happen for 2 or 3 years. There's just a lot smaller group of people that would participate in enhancing the habitat type.
And I will add, you know, especially with a lot of organizations, and one of the things that we've been working on through the North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance is trying to figure out how to make those native seeds, not even just to the Southeast, but to North Carolina, how to make those local ecotypes more available. And that's a huge problem. There's a huge lack of source centers for a lot of those native seeds in North Carolina in the Southeast. And the nurseries that are available are really great and do provide a lot of great species, but they're small nurseries. And so for some of these large scale projects, they're not able to provide what we need. So one of our main goals is working towards how to increase that seed sourcing, how to increase the commercial availability for a lot of these native species that we've seen that do well on these projects. All right, I think we have time for one more question. We only have a minute or two left. And we're going to say, so do the landowners pay for the service, or is a donation of a portion of their property? I'm assuming for the pollinator plantings.
With farm bill programs, the participants, the landowners, it's a voluntary program, so they do agree to take their property out of production for whatever length of time the contract requires. As a general rule, each program has a little different payment scenario, but as a general rule, they're probably getting paid the majority of the installation cost. Some programs do pay a rental payment for that property to be in a conservation cover. And some programs do factor in a foregone income payment that what the landowner's giving up for taking that out of row crop or cattle production.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to the next segment, but like I said at the beginning of our webinar, we're going to try to answer all of these questions that we don't get to and send them out in an email to everybody that registered. So if your question didn't get answered, don't fret one bit. We'll try to get it answered over the next few weeks for you. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. She is Hannah Levinson. She is a PhD candidate at NC State working under Dr. David Tarpey. She's conducting a multi-year statewide survey of native bee populations in North Carolina with a focus on evaluating the impacts of planted habitat as a conservation method. So Hannah, when you're ready, go for it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gabrielle. Oh, hold on. All right. Thank you. So usually when we do these field days, you got to see the plots that we planted and all the flowers, and we usually get to take a minute and just kind of frolic through the flowers on beautiful weather. So instead of that, since we can't do that today, just imagine, now that you've seen it, imagine during this whole presentation that you're in those fields, and together we'll just have to be happy with that. But anyways, so today we're going to talk about field collection, identification, tips, and tricks. So I'm going to talk about what you can use to collect insects. It's really great to collect insects and take a closer look at them. You can learn a lot more when you just get them to slow down for a second and you can take a minute and check them out. And then I'll talk about how you can use all those tools. And then we'll talk about, once you have an insect and you're able to look at it, what sort of things you could look at to be able to identify it, or at least narrow down what you're looking at. And I want to make a note that I am going to focus on native bees here. That is what my research is on. That's what I feel I can speak about. But a lot of these tips could be applied to many other insects, even other organisms. You would just have to change up the specific details a little bit. But a lot of the collection methods and the idea of looking at different parts of the body can be used for other insects. All right, so now what you can use to collect. So I'll talk about a couple different tools. The first one is hand nets. These are the most common by far for hobbyists, scientists. I use these every day doing my research. They're really great because you can collect either large amounts of insects at once or large insects without damaging them, or damaging them as little as possible. You can also get a kind where this pole extends, so you can reach up into really high places, or you can reach far away if it's a fast insect. And there's even kinds where the net itself will compact down and fold down and you can take it to travel. So it's a really, really great tool. And then in conjunction with that, a lot of people use tubes. So you can either net an insect and then put it into a tube, which I'll show you in a minute exactly how to do that, or you can use the tube directly to capture an insect. And then the last one that's kind of scientific is aspirators. So these are really useful for more slow moving insects. You would use this breathing tube to actually suck up an insect through this metal straw and into the collection chamber. It stops the insect. You would not actually breathe it all the way up. And I'll show you a video of how to use that in a second. But these are kind of scientific. They are specialty, or maybe hobbyists know where to get them. But you can use other things in your house. You can use jars of any size. Basically, you need something that is big enough where you are keeping yourself and the insect safe, and that you can close it off quickly so that the insect doesn't escape and you have a chance to look at it. So you can get creative with what sort of objects, if you have Tupperware, jars, anything like that could be used. So now I'll show you each of these tools in action. So the first is the net, of course. And basically, there are a couple ways you can use the net. The main way is over flowers, especially in my research with bees. So as you saw, you want to go all the way to the ground. You want to cover the plant as much as possible with the net. And insects have a tendency to go up towards light, so you want to use that to your advantage. If you cover the whole plant, they have nowhere to go but up. And then as you see, once it gets to the top of the net, I kind of pinch off the net so that I limit the space it can go and I can keep track of where the insect is. So once it's in the net, you would then use a tube or another object, and you reach in and you actually are trying to coax the insect into that object. So again, insects like to go up. I use that to my advantage. This will loop again so we can show you really quickly. So you use their behavior to your advantage. And don't be scared to reach your hand in the net. If you're conscious of where they are not paying attention to you. You can see I tip the tube up, so then the insect goes up into the tube without me having to do anything. And then you close the tube up and you have your insect and you can look at it. All right, and then while we're on the topic of tubes, I mentioned you could use them just directly. So here's some examples of how you can just tube a bee straight off a flower. So you could do this with really small bees, just cover the whole flower so it has nowhere to go but up, and the insect does the work for you. I'll let that play one more time. And then with larger bees, you just need a larger tube, but it's the same exact thing. They'll go right up and then close it off so that they have nowhere to go but up. All right. So then next is the aspirator. I don't have one of these at home. So I used a video from YouTube. You can check it out if you want the full length version. But you can see you just breathe through the breathing part and use the metal straw to suck up the insects. They'll go into your collection chamber, which is the little clear part here. Again, there's a filter so the insects won't make it to your mouth. But then once you have collected however many you want, you can take that container and either transfer them to other containers or just look at them straight in that container. So it's a really great way if you're trying to reach into where an insect is, and like I said, it's a little better for slow moving insects. And then the last one is a jar, but you could imagine any sort of container here. I just used a jar, and it's the same idea as the tubes, very straightforward. The insect does the work for you, it just flies right up. But it is important to cover as much of the flower as possible. You want to close off the mouth of the jar or whatever you're using with the plant if possible. And something to note that larger mouth jars will be harder to close quickly. So just keep that in mind if you are trying to use this. All right, so now pretend you have a bee that you've collected and you're checking it out and you want to try to figure out what kind of bee you're looking at. So here are some things to keep in mind now that you can get a closer look. The first is you want to check, is it a bee? So it's very easy to confuse wasps and other insects like flies for bees. So before you even try to identify what bee you're looking at, make sure it's a bee. A couple things to look for: if you saw in this little clip how the wasp is not actually flying to the flowers. That clip is really short, so it might be hard to see, but it's kind of inspecting around the flowers. So wasps get their protein from other organisms, many times other insects, and bees get their protein from pollen. So wasps are hunters, and because of that, they spend less time on flowers compared to bees. So if you see something kind of scoping the ground or the area around flowers, that is an indication it could be a wasp rather than a bee. Other things to look for is the general body shape. So wasps aren't as furry or hairy because they don't collect pollen like bees do. So they don't have pollen collecting hairs on their body. So they kind of look sleek and aerodynamic, kind of a little dangerous. They also have what we call a wasp waist. You can see here, this connection in their body gets really tiny and very precise. And then another thing to keep in mind is the number of wings. So wasps and bees have 4 wings. It's a little hard to see here, but hopefully you can see one wing, one small wing, and then a second wing, a third wing, and then a 4th wing in the back. So bees and wasps, 4 wings. And then in comparison, flies only have 2 wings. So if you can take a second and check out the wings, that will be a dead giveaway if it's a fly or not. Other things to look for on flies. So here's an example of, even though this is wasp kind of yellow jacket coloring, if you notice it has 2 wings. So don't let the coloring trick you. The insects definitely try to mimic each other. Flies also have these huge fly eyes. You can see this compared to the wasp eyes here. And flies usually have little to no visible antenna. So you can see how short this antenna is. It basically looks like a single hair. And then bees and wasps will have these long elbowed antenna. So take a second and check out these body parts to kind of figure out what insect you're looking at. So let's say you have figured out it's a bee. There's a couple things next to look at to try to narrow down what bee you're looking at. So you can use color as a really big indicator. You can see here this bee is bright metallic green. So that is a very simple example where clearly if it's bright green, you can easily tell that it's that kind of bee versus another. But there are lots of different colors of bees. They can be metallic blue, kind of golden, black. So color is a really good thing to check out at first. You can also look at the color of the hair they have. So this is an example of a bumblebee. And if you look, she has very distinct black and yellow hair bands along her body. And the patterning of those hair bands will tell you what species you're looking at. So another example of how color can be used to help you out. But one thing to keep in mind is for native bees, the males and females can look completely different from each other. So this is an example of a male bumblebee. You can see how extensive his yellow hairs are along the back side of his body. And the female of this bee looks completely different to the point where you might not know it's even the same species. So just something to keep in mind. Males usually have more yellow hair or more yellow coloring directly on the surface of their body. So take a second and just check out what you're looking at. The next thing you can use is size. So when bees emerge, they emerge fully grown. If you see a small bee, it's because it's a small bee. It's not going to grow anymore. So you can use size to help you narrow down what you're looking at. The example I have here, we're looking at a carpenter bee. I use this example. I like to talk about it because they're very easily confused with bumblebees. But you can see here, a bumblebee will come in, just how different in size they are. Now, there are some bumblebee species in North Carolina that will be slightly larger than this species I have here, but carpenter bees are more often than not much larger than bumblebees. So that's one thing to look at. And then kind of going back to the color a little bit, if you look at the very beginning of this clip right here, carpenter bees are completely bare on the backside of their abdomen. They do not have hair, so they will look shiny and metallic and reflective. And that's because they don't have hair. Where you can see here, this bumblebee has black and yellow hair all the way down her abdomen. So if you see a shiny bee that looks like a bumblebee, It's probably a carpenter bee. And then the last trick is looking at where a bee carries their pollen. So bees can carry their pollen on different places in their body. One of the ones that we're most familiar with is pollen balls. This is an example here. So this is a very specific structure on the hind legs of bees. They're called corbicula or pollen baskets. And bumblebees and honeybees are the only ones here that have this structure. So if you see a pollen ball, it should be very precise like that. You automatically know it's a bumblebee or a honeybee, and you can usually tell those two apart. So you can narrow down really quickly what you're looking at. But then alternatively, if you see something, even if it looks like a bumblebee or looks like a honeybee, but it does not have pollen in a pollen ball, it cannot be a honeybee or a bumblebee. The most common way that most bee species carry pollen is all over their hind legs. You can see here this tiny bee, her back legs are all bright yellow and orange. That is completely full of pollen. And so you can see it's not as precise as the pollen ball. She doesn't pack it into the ball shape. She just kind of lets all of the hair on her back legs carry the pollen. So that's the most common way that bees carry pollen. And then the last way I'll talk about is on the underside of their abdomen, or you could call it their belly. This example here is really great because this bee is all black and her belly is bright yellow because she's completely full of pollen, and she has her pollen collecting hairs on her belly. Here's a close-up shot of that same kind of bee. You can see they only have it on the underside of their belly. Their legs don't have a lot of pollen. And these are mostly mason bees and leafcutter bees. So when you notice where a bee is carrying its pollen, it can really narrow down what you're looking at. Here's another example of a different species. And you can see when she wiggles her abdomen like that, she's actually packing the pollen from that flower onto her belly hairs. So taking a second and observing a bee's behavior can also give you some hints about what kind of bee it is. And then here's that same species. Hopefully you can see her white hairs here on the underside of her belly. All right. So with that, if this piqued your interest and you want to know a little bit more about identifying bees, you can check out this book that Elsa Youngstead and I, who's speaking next, wrote together called The Bees of North Carolina, an Identification Guide. It'll talk about the most commonly occurring groups of bees in North Carolina, a little bit of fun facts about those bees. It'll point out specific body parts to look at to identify them from other bees. It'll talk about where they nest, how big you can expect them to be, and what time of year you can expect to see them. To find it, it is published through NC State Extension, so there's a free PDF version available for everyone if you go to this link. There's also a bound copy available for purchase if you prefer that, or you can search the title and it should come up on Google within the first couple of links. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Great, thank you, Hannah. That was really interesting. So just to add, so thanks to Hannah for making that really good presentation with some interactive videos. Normally when we're doing this in the field, as you can imagine, everybody has a net and Hannah has a lot of visual aids and she's going around and helping people catch bees. So it's sort of hard to translate that into a video, but she did a great job. So we have a few questions. One question is, how long do bees live? And I think I'm going to wait for that question until Elsa speaks, because that's kind of incorporated into some of the things that she's going to be discussing. And then there's another question, does the bee that is larger than a bumblebee also pollinate productively? Hannah can go ahead and answer that.
Hi, yeah, so you're talking about the carpenter bee. Carpenter bees are pollinators. A lot of people get annoyed with them for their nesting habitats, but they do pollinate. They're actually the perfect pollinator for passion fruit based on their size. So they fit perfectly under that flower where smaller bees can sneak and steal the nectar without actually pollinating the flowers. So for passion fruit, they are extremely important pollinators. But because they're generalist pollinators, which means they are attracted to and can survive off of many kinds of flowers, they'll go to basically all these flowers we've talked about for the pollinator plots they can visit. And they've been found visiting several different species of crops, and they do pollinate. Different species of bees are more or less efficient depending on the plant you're looking at. So I can't say every time they're the most efficient pollinator, but they definitely are important pollinators.
Alrighty, thank you, Hannah. So I think we're going to move on next to Elsa, Dr. Elsa Youngstadt. She is an assistant professor of applied ecology at NC State University. Her lab does research in urban ecology, particularly ecology of insects and plant-insect interactions. For example, current projects in her lab ask which kinds of urban land uses, help, or hinder bee movement, and how urban warming shapes the ecology and evolution of bees and ants. Outside the city, she also works on pollination biology of rare plants. So Elsa, when you're ready, take it away.
I forgot to unmute myself before I shared my screen. Okay, let's try that again. Can you see my screen?
No, we can't see your screen. We did briefly, but then it went away.
How about now? Oh wait, no. Sorry guys, all that practice.
All right, there you go.
All right, sorry about that. I
No
promise
worries.
I practiced this, you guys. All right, anyway, thanks Gabriella, and thanks everybody for tuning in to our virtual field day. So you just learned a lot of great information about how to install pollinator habitat on a large scale and how to start monitoring and identifying bees in that habitat. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about how those bees actually make a living. And like pretty much all animals, bees have sort of two basic needs in order to survive and thrive. And the one we do tend to talk about the most is food, adding flowers to the landscape for pollen and nectar. The other big requirement is shelter. Bees have to have some place to take all that pollen and nectar that they're collecting so they can safely stash it away for their offspring to feed on and to develop. And so this picture shows a cluster of mining bee nests, each of which is home to a single bee. If you look closely, you might see a bee popping in and out of those holes. And nesting habitat can be harder to manage than flowering resources, and I'll warn you now that there is not a lot of clear sort of research-based tested practices out there that prove like this activity will enhance nesting habitats and bee productivity and that one won't. So there are some things we know though that suggest that it will be beneficial to attempt to augment and manage nesting habitat. So first of all, we know that the farther bees have to fly between their flowers and their nests, the less successful they are at producing offspring. It's a lot of wasted time and effort, all of that commuting. And so it follows that by having nesting resources in the habitat near the flowers, you're saving them a lot of time and trouble and allowing them to produce more offspring. There's also evidence in agricultural habitats, especially for mason bees, that adding nesting blocks to the habitat can increase the number of bees foraging in the crop and thus pollinating it, and can also increase the reproductive success of that population. So with that as our motivation to go on, today we're going to take over the next few minutes, take a look at some of the nesting resources that are important to wild bees in North Carolina. Before we get to that, we're actually going to take a quick step back and look at some of the diversity and like the context of their life cycle in which that nesting is taking place. So you probably already noticed that I showed you pictures of two completely different kinds of nests, nests in the ground, nests in a wooden block, and that's just the beginning of it. In North Carolina, we have nearly 600 species of bees. I think we're around 560 some at last count. And they come in a huge variety of shapes and sizes. And each of these species has its own particular nesting habitats that match its shape and size and life cycle. So despite all this variety, there are a few things that all of these bees have in common. And so we'll look at those shared things before we branch out and look at their different nesting resources. And so they all share some elements of their life cycle. And we'll start with the foraging adult bee. This is the stage we're used to seeing out on flowers. It's the most familiar. And that bee, assuming it's a female, what she's doing she's out collecting food and maybe construction materials to take back to her nest. The bee in this picture is in the family Megachilidae, the one that Hannah mentioned in the previous section that carries the pollen on her belly, which you can see here as well. So this is the nest entrance that this bee might be heading back to. And what goes on inside is what happens throughout most of the year when we don't see the bee out foraging. Inside, she'll take that pollen and nectar that she's collecting on flowers, she'll take it inside the nest and sort of compile it into a provision that is enough for one offspring to develop on. She'll lay an egg on that provision. The egg will hatch into a larva and eat all that pollen and nectar. That usually takes a week or two. Then it will pupate. It's sort of a non-feeding, resting, well, not resting, but sort of transitional phase in between the larva and the adult. And then that pupa will transform into an adult bee that will emerge and start the cycle over again. This whole process, depending on the species, can take about a month to about a year to complete. And so to answer the question about bee lifespans, they also similarly vary from about a month to about a year, depending on the species. And in the case of social bees, where there's a division of labor with a queen that lays eggs and workers who do foraging and nest maintenance, the lifespans can also differ between those particular castes. So when it comes down to it, though, the bee that we see like out on the flowers, the thing that, you know, when you say the word bee, the thing you envision is actually a pretty fleeting part of this life cycle. And there's much more time of the year where the bee is spent hidden away in an immature stage inside a nest. And those nests are, in fact, our focus of this section today. And we'll start with kind of an overview of nesting habits. There's 4 major sort of substrates that we can think of bees nesting in. And those are soil, wood, plant stems, and cavities. And cavities is kind of a catch-all category that includes things like rodent burrows, birdhouses, voids in stone walls, maybe even snail shells and garden hoses. And then within these 4 categories of these 4 sort of substrates, there's also 3 approaches to creating or using a nest in those substrates. A bee might build its own nest, like actually actively excavating a hole in that material. Some bees are known as renters, ones who find pre-existing tunnels or cavities and use those without actually excavating them themselves. And then there are the parasites, which we're not going to talk about a lot today, but these are bees who come upon the active nests of other bees. They sneak in and lay an egg on the pollen that the resident bee compiled for its own offspring. So between these 4 substrates and 3 approaches, we have a total of 12 ways of nesting, but not all of the ways are equally common. By far the most diverse group of bees are those that build their nests in the soil. It's over half of our species here in North Carolina. By comparison, those that actively excavate nests in wood and stems are very few, just 2 and 6 species respectively. Then if we move to the renters, those who come upon pre-existing holes and use those, the most common substrates to rent are holes in wood and plant stems. Together, those make up about 20% of our bee diversity. And then finally, the parasites are kind of a surprisingly large proportion of our diversity. About 20% of our bee species are actually parasites on other bees who build nests in the soil. We're not going to dwell on the parasites today, but it's worth knowing that they're out there. And maybe someday we'll do another talk where you learn much more about them. So given that variety of nesting habits, we'll talk now about some of the who some of these bees are. This is kind of the abstract overview. Who are the real bees and the actual nests? So we'll start with those soil builders. And these, obviously there are hundreds of species. These are just a few of the sort of better known or economically important ones. Hopefully you can see my mouse in the top left. We have a mining bee. This is actually a very diverse genus of bees, and as a group, they're very important pollinators of fruit trees in the spring, as well as various wild plants. Blueberry bees here in the top right are semi-specialized pollinators on blueberry, and they're among the most efficient pollinators of that plant. Squash bee, you could kind of say the same, but substitute the word squash for blueberry. They're very specialized on squash, pumpkins, and gourds. And then this is a cellophane bee in the act of pollinating a blackberry, also a ground nester. So this is just a tiny sample of some of that ground nesting diversity, but some of the bees you might want to have around. And if you were scouting for nests, this is what you might actually see. It doesn't look like much. This sort of sad looking lawn here is actually covered in nests of mining bees or cellophane bees, I don't remember. Their nests look very similar from the outside. And if you're lucky, you might see bees popping in and out of those holes. And you really do need to see the bees coming and going to know who made the holes, because wasps and ants can also make pretty similar looking nests. Some of the flashier and more distinctive ground nests are made by these chimney bees or digger bees. This is the bee in the genus Anthophora with her little chimney. So those are some of the things you might see above ground. If you had X-ray vision and you could see into the ground, you would see a much more interesting structure. This illustration shows a ground nest of a digger bee. So you have sort of a main tunnel and several branches, and then each branch contains little side chambers in which the bee has compiled pollen, laid an egg. You have larvae in different stages of development. This is a zoomed in illustration of one of those chambers. And nests, for most species, these nests are in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil. There are a few that can extend as far as a few feet deep, some that are just in the top couple of inches, but sort of 6 to 12 is a good bet. This is a rare look inside the nest of a ground nesting bee. The nest has been opened, but you can see the bee herself on this side. And this is the chamber that contains the pollen ball and an egg laid on it. So what can we actually do for these species? Suppose we do want them around in our habitat. Like I said earlier, there's not a ton of research-based, like tested advice, but based on sort of decades of observations and expert opinion and some data, we know that there are certain conditions that seem to turn up often in places that there are nests. These are things we think ground nesting bees like. That includes soil with at least some sand content, pretty sparse vegetation. They need access to that soil surface to dig their nests. Morning sun exposure is usually a plus, especially for those early spring bees who need to warm up in the mornings. There are some species who like to have their nest entrances situated at the base of small rocks or cobbles. And this has actually been tested for one particular species of sweat bee, that if you add sort of these Oreo-sized cobbles, that they prefer to nest at the base of those. There are other species that like to nest in vertical banks, such as at the edges of ditches or streams. So that's another place that you can look for nests. And then they also most species prefer lower soil moisture, no soggy, saturated soil for nesting. And sort of by extension, then those are things you can kind of zero in on if you're looking for nesting areas that you want to maintain. Things that can discourage nesting include tillage. It often decreases the attractiveness of soil, or even if bees still nest in tilled soil, their nests will get destroyed next time it gets tilled, so survival tends to be low. Dense turf, thick mulch, and landscape fabric are all barriers to ground nesting, as is irrigation. And in fact, so honestly, I get more questions about how can I get rid of a nesting aggregation of mining bees or cellophane bees, as opposed to how can I encourage them. And applying a thick mulch is actually a fairly benign way to encourage them to move. If you have an aggregation in an area that you just can't tolerate them there, you can wait for their activity to subside for the year, then cover that area with a thick layer of mulch. The next generation will still be able to emerge through the mulch, but they won't want to dig back through it, so they'll tend to move somewhere else. So that's some tips for our soil nesting bees. The options are actually much better developed for our wood and stem nesting bees. Even though they're a smaller proportion of our bee diversity, their nesting habits are a lot easier to observe and manipulate. To give examples of some of these species, these are mainly the Megachilidae, those mason and leaf-cutting bees, which you can recognize by the pollen on their bellies if they're carrying pollen. Otherwise, you can look for those longer pollen-carrying hairs, even if there's not pollen on them. So this one, the one on the far left and the one on the far right are both leaf-cutting bees. The two in the middle, those both bluish bees, are both mason bees. And if you have or find their nests, this is what you will tend to see from the outside. Not a lot going on, just a little hole into a block of wood or a piece of old wood. If you're lucky, you see a bee peeking out. And what's happening on the inside is what you can see in these cross sections. So the architecture is not nearly as elaborate as for some of the ground nesting bees. They're pretty constrained by being in this little tube. And the tube will have one closed end, or the tube, or the beetle burrow in old wood that they're using, whatever sort of hole they're in. It'll have a back, and the bee will head toward the back end. She might stop short of the exact back. She'll build some sort of partition, put in her pollen, lay an egg, build another partition, and proceed. So the principles are the same as the ground nesting bees. The architecture is just a little different. And you can see in each of these nests, so the one on the bottom is made by a leaf-cutting bee, and she has used neatly cut pieces of leaf to line and partition each cell. So the pollen and larvae are much harder to see because they're closed off by leaves here. This is a nest of a mason bee who has used sort of masticated, chewed up leaf pulp to make her partitions. And this is a nest of a mason bee, a different species, that uses mud to make her partitions. So these bees, even though we call them renters, they do still need some construction materials. They are finding pre-existing holes, but they do a lot of remodeling. So when we're thinking about their habitat, it's useful not just to stick out some nesting holes, but also to think about whether those other resources are also present. And we'll talk about some of those other resources first before we talk about the actual nesting holes. And so for leaf-cutting bees, you need to have the leaves that they like in the environment. Most of them are not specialized, they're not terribly picky, but there are some plants that they seem to prefer. Those include things like rose, redbud, grapevines, smilax, not a very friendly plant to have around, greenbrier, but they do use those leaves quite often. Buckwheat and honeysuckle are all plants that get used to construct these little nesting cells inside leafcutter bee nests, so you might consider making sure some of those are in your landscape. Mud is another important one that mason bees, especially the blue orchard bee, need to use to build their nest cells. And so you can also scout your habitat for mud, and you might have just natural wet spots. There might be a slowly leaking hose or something that has a reliable source of water to make a little bit of mud. If none of those things are in your environment, you can also sort of dig a little purpose-made trench to expose some mud and add a little bit of moisture to it so that mud is available. And in fact, some suppliers will actually even sell you mud that is the preferred consistency of mason bees, so that you can actually dig a little trench and put that mud in there so you know they've got exactly what they like. I've never done that. You're gonna excuse me, my cat is knocking on the door. Okay, so those are some of the nesting resources that that even these stem nesting bees will need to fix up the insides of their stem or wood holes. And then how about the holes themselves? You're probably familiar with these in the form of bee hotels, which come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes. These are a few examples, and these are widely available for purchase or with plans on the internet for do-it-yourself projects. And even with all that variety, we can kind of break them down into two major designs. There's sort of the block type, which is either solid wood with holes drilled in it or grooved boards that you stack together to create holes. Those are easier to clean. Or there's the bundle type, which consists of purchased cardboard or reeds or locally collected materials sort of bundled together. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the pros and cons of the different designs today. I will say that in some trials we did in Raleigh last year, the bundles of natural material were the most occupied by bees as opposed to by wasps. So there's a lot of room to experiment and tinker with different materials. I would warn you against plastic straws though. They may look tempting in terms of being the right size and the right length and diameter, but bees that use them tend to have mold problems and poor success if they're brewed. Other things to think about are the diameter and length of the holes. Different species prefer different diameter of nesting tubes, so my recommendation is really just to offer a variety of hole sizes ranging from about 1/8 of an inch or a little bit less, all the way up to 3/8 or maybe even close to 1/2 an inch. And you want the length to be around 8 inches, not much shorter, because without going into the details, tubes that are too short produce an excess of male bees and will mess up the sex ratio of the next generation. And once you have your bundle or your block, where are you gonna put it? Again, advice is based mainly on conventional wisdom, some data. You want the entrances facing south to southeast. Again, that gets the morning sun exposure and an earlier start to foraging. About 4 or 5 feet off the ground on a wall or a fence post or a trellis, not blocked by vegetation, and within about a 1/4 mile of the flowers and construction materials that they also need to complete their life cycle. Finally, there's some maintenance to consider. Bees that are normally solitary and sort of scattered through the landscape are getting concentrated into a group of nesting blocks, or a group of nesting holes that are bundled together in a block, and that can produce sort of a bigger signal to their parasites. Use of the same block year after year can accumulate parasites, diseases, fungi, so there's some maintenance involved. But the trouble is there's no time of year when that bee hotel is completely empty. So when you take it down and clean it or replace it, the solution to this conundrum is the emergence box, one of which is, well, 2 of which are shown here. These are nice, hinged ones. The key ingredients are that it is an opaque box, and it has a small bee-sized entrance, or actually exit hole right there, just one. And so in the fall, you would take your bee hotel down and put it inside this emergence box, store it somewhere cold over the winter, so everybody gets their winter hibernation experience. In the spring, you would set it back out. These bees will mature, they will emerge from the bee hotel, they will see the light from that little bee-sized exit hole, and they will leave, but this is not something that's attractive for them to come back into. So you would leave this out, and then meanwhile, you would put up a fresh bee hotel for them to colonize. And then over the course of the summer, everyone would emerge from this nest, and you can then take it out in the fall and clean it or discard it. And if all that sounds like a lot of work, there are other options for enhancing nesting habitat for stem and wood nesting bees without going to the trouble of actually maintaining a house. Sumac is one of the sort of best producers of hollow twigs that bees will nest in. So that, as well as elderberry and some roses, are another good source of twigs that bees will just sort of use on a natural cycle without you having to do any particular maintenance. Wood piles, dead wood that is occupied by beetles who then, make an exit hole. That's a very natural nesting habitat for these bees, so keeping some dead wood around the environment can also produce nesting habitat without the maintenance of a bee hotel. And then this is another creative option that they're actually doing at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Every year when they cut back their perennial stems, they weave them into these pretty little wattle fences, which then get occupied by bees and other insects, but they gradually decay sort of on their own cycle. So those are some of our options for the wood and stem nesters. And let's take a quick look then at our cavity nesters, which in this category, it's not a lot of species. There's only about 15 or 20. The heavy hitters are the bumblebees, who we all can, I think everybody can love a bumblebee. They're big and they're fuzzy and they're really efficient pollinators. They have a long foraging season, they have long flight distances, and they can visit a wide variety of plants and pollinate them efficiently. So they're good ones to have around. They're economically important and important for pollination in natural habitats. Their nesting habits vary with the species. One of our more common species is the common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. It's shown here on the left. This bee is actually leaving her nest. It's a very subtle little entrance underneath this leaf. And they actually nest, their nests are subterranean in old rodent burrows. And they're very easy to miss if you don't walk by it right at the moment that a bee is coming in and out. Another common bee here in central North Carolina is the brown-belted bumblebee, named for the second segment on the abdomen, which is kind of brown. And they are very often found in old bluebird boxes where the nest hasn't been cleaned out from year to year. So that's a great nesting resource from them, and presumably they would have done this in tree holes before bluebird boxes were available. If you could look inside those nests, this is what you'd see. This is a Bombus impatiens colony on the left. They can have several hundred workers who manage all of this brood and pollen and nectar while the queen lays eggs. If you peered inside one of those bluebird boxes, the nest is often pretty well hidden by the nesting material. If you get in farther, you can see the nesting structure and far fewer workers. These are much smaller colonies. So because bumblebees are such efficient pollinators, there's been a lot of time and effort spent trying to create nesting habitat for them. This is just one of many examples of plans for bumblebee boxes or flower pots that you can overturn and make a tunnel. Before I talk any more about that, I would say I wouldn't really spend a lot of time trying to do this, because studies that have tested and compared different designs of artificial bumblebee boxes, especially in the eastern US, are just very poorly occupied. Maybe a couple % of them get used. So it's almost not worth the trouble. I think if I were gonna try to build something, it would be a birdhouse, because we know that they like to come behind the birds and use those. Otherwise, it would be sort of a benign neglect of forest edges, maybe leaving a little bit of deadwood and brush and leaf litter to encourage those kinds of habitats where the common eastern bumblebee will nest. And then there are also a few species that will nest at the ground surface under sort of clumping native grasses. So things like switch grasses are worth making sure you have in the habitat. All right, so that is our whirlwind tour of the various nesting habits and habitats. I want to leave you with just a few sort of take-homes from that. First of all, bees in North Carolina are diverse. We're well above 500 species, and they each have their own nesting habits. So there's not any one-size-fits-all solution. Habitat creation is really the best established for stem nesters and wood nesters, which are a relative minority of our species. It's certainly worth doing, but the majority of economically important species nest in the soil or in other cavities. And for those, the management recommendations are less well established. So here, I would recommend, vigilance, look for nests where you have them, keep doing what you're doing. There's room for intelligent tinkering and maybe some benign neglect. And finally, I just want to remind you that even though we see bees during this fleeting adult stage, and that's what we think of as maybe kind of the true bee, the vast majority of their life cycle is actually spent tucked away in these places that we rarely see them. So next time you're out creating pollinator habitat or scouting your landscape, keep in mind some of these hidey places and think about how you might be able to enhance those aspects of your habitat in addition to flowers. So that is what I've got, and I didn't look at the clock, but hopefully I've left us plenty of time for questions.
Yeah, you did great. And we have several questions for you. So when you're ready, let me start reading some of them off. We had quite a few questions about bee hotels, and here's one about, or maybe if you can just talk about ways, good practices for cleaning, whether it's replacing the tubes or if there's some kind of liquid cleaning.
Right, good questions. So for the natural materials like reeds or locally collected stems, also if you're using any of the cardboard or paper tubes, which I didn't talk about but don't necessarily recommend because they're more susceptible to parasites. Anyway, if you're using any of those sort of bundle designs, I would just discard those after they're empty, compost them or whatever. They would be very hard to clean. If you're using the wooden block type, those can be bleached, much like you would bleach, parts of a honeybee hive before you put them back into use. So I think I've seen the recommendation of maybe a 1 to 3 bleach solution for 5 minutes and let it thoroughly, sun dry before you would put it back into use.
All right. will some native bees use heavily compacted clay soil?
They will. There are a few species that are known to like clay soil. There's one of our mining bees, Andrina barbara. I see them actually in all sorts of soil, from like the most compacted red clay to very sandy soil. Tilothrix, the mallow bee, is another one that's known to like clay soils. In fact, they have kind of a cool behavior where they will carry droplets of water back to their nest to moisten the soil so they can dig it up. Because if they didn't do that, they would just be impenetrable soil. So those are a couple of them. There are a handful. It seems like sandy soils tend to be the more preferred, but hard packed clay is not out of the question for nesting.
And as an aside to that question, or kind of a add-on to that question, what happens to ground nesting bees when we see some of these flooding events?
That is a great question. I would say we mostly don't really know. There are some examples of cellophane bees, the genus Calides, and they line their cells with this secretion that, the reason they're called cellophane bees is because they have this secretion, they daub it on the nest walls, and when it hardens, it's sort of like a polyester or cellophane type material that makes a breathable, waterproof lining. And those bees sometimes do nest in really wet places that have been submerged for like a month or something, and they're still totally fine. But for bees that normally live on higher ground and are not adapted to flooding, I don't think there's a lot of evidence one way or the other. If Hannah wants to chime in here, I think she's actually been doing a study of this because some of her study sites were recently flooded. So Hannah, if you're still around and want to add to that, you may have a better handle on what happens.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to add other than I think the time of year also matters. So like Elsa just mentioned, some bees can waterproof their nests. So if the flooding happens before that is done, of course, the nests aren't waterproofed. So if it happens later in the season, they have a better chance. And it also depends on exactly how used to flooding those bees are in that area. Like if the area is a commonly flooded, it's right next to a river, perhaps those populations could be more adapted to flooding. But if it's a unexpected event like the hurricane we had in 2018, those populations aren't as used to flooding, so they might be more susceptible. But like Elsa said, we don't have a clear answer one way or the other.
All right, Elsa, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to ask you something that I know you love to talk about. How do you prevent carpenter bees from drilling holes in porches or people's homes?
Right. So this is a perennial problem. I will first say sort of the standard advice, like if you read kind of all the extension documents and pest control manuals, they will say that painted wood is less likely to be drilled in than unfinished wood. Treated wood, however, is not particularly protected, so that's unhelpful. Staining also doesn't particularly help. So paint is a good line of defense. It doesn't hold up forever. And anytime that I'm actually in a room of people who I can see, and I say that, a whole bunch of hands go up and they're like, oh, they're painting, drilling in my painted XYZ. So it's a start. It's not a perfect solution. Hardwoods also tend to be less preferred than softwoods. Pine, redwood are both very soft and sort of welcoming to carpenter bees. We actually have an experiment ongoing where we have a bunch of benches out on volunteers' porches with 10 different kinds of wood in the seat, including treated and painted, as well as woods of different hardness. So over the next few years, we're hoping that some of those boards will be colonized and others will not, so we could have a better, more firm answer to that. But right now, it's probably a matter of using paint where you can. Sometimes I've seen people put sort of like, depending on where the wood is, like a hardware cloth barrier over it with a small mesh size, can keep them out, can keep them from accessing that wood if it's just like on the underside of a deck or something. And otherwise, like just replacing boards once they've become too damaged is the other intervention that you can do.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great, useful information. So we are on our last segment of our webinar. We're going to be hearing from Sydney Ross. She is the Pesticide Operations Specialist for the North Carolina Department of Ag and Consumer Services, Structural Pest Control and Pesticides Division. And Sydney is responsible for answering all the complaint calls in the state related to outdoor use of pesticides. She delegates these complaints to field staff and works with the division's legal team to manage investigations and enforcement issues. She's also the data steward for the FieldWatch program that helps beekeepers register their hives online to mitigate pesticide drift. So Sydney, when you're ready, you have the floor.
Hi there. Hopefully you can hear me now. Let's see. Okay, so thank you, Gabriella, for that introduction. Like Gabriella said, I work for the Department of Agriculture's pesticide section. We're the regulatory agency that's responsible for any type of pesticide use in the state. Specifically, I work for just the pesticide section, so that's outdoor use of pesticides. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about a few different things, and a lot of this information is going to be more specific to beekeepers, but we might also have some farmers or landscapers on the line, or maybe just some folks who love bees, so this hopefully will be interesting to you as well. So some of the things I'm going to go over are pesticide regulations in North Carolina. What is myth? What is facts? I get a lot of calls about how, you know, someone will kind of make a statement and they'll say, well, I know that, you know, pesticide applicators aren't supposed to do this. And a lot of times I'm going to be providing them with information. And so that's kind of what I'm going to go over a little bit in the beginning of the presentation. I'm also going to talk about common violations and where they come from in terms of, you know, where they come in our law. I'm going to talk a little bit about using pesticides safely as a beekeeper and also just as a homeowner or a landscape applicator. And then finally, we'll get a little bit into reporting a bee kill. I'm going to talk to you about active ingredients and, you know, just kind of overall how they affect pollinator health. And then finally, we'll end on FieldWatch. So the first thing here, a lot of times, like I said, I will get people calling me saying things like, there's a mosquito applicator in my neighborhood and I have bees and I don't know what to do. I'm hoping that through this sort of section of the presentation, I can kind of dispel some myths. But the first thing that I want to say is that, you know, of course, beekeeping is a very important and amazing service that you provide to our agricultural community. And it's something that takes a lot of love and a lot of effort. And so I know it can be incredibly frustrating when you see down the street that your neighbors are spraying for mosquitoes or spraying their lawn all the time. Our division is here to help you. We really are here to answer any questions that you have, to be the middleman so that you don't have to go out and kind of talk to the landscape applicators. So my biggest takeaway from this is please call us. I know that my phone number is at the end of this presentation, so you can reach me directly, and then we can kind of, you know, help you out there. So the first thing that I hear pretty often is pesticide applicators can't spray in the daytime. Unfortunately, this is a myth. Our applicators do work a normal 9-to-5 job, and we do have to kind of respect that somebody in the neighborhood has hired them to come onto their property to perform a service. It could be spraying for weeds, it could be spraying mosquitoes, but overall, you know, we all kind of have to work together to cooperate because, you know, somebody did want them there on purpose, and I know it can be very frustrating, but, you know, what I generally suggest is to go up to the applicator if they are close to your house or close to your beehives and just calmly explain that you have bees there. And also make sure that you put your hives on mapping sites like FieldWatch, because that can be really important. A lot of our applicators do check those sites really frequently. And so having them identified online is kind of the first line of defense. The second thing that I hear a lot is, you know, I've kind of told the pesticide applicator that I have bees, so they should stop spraying. Unfortunately, just you telling them that you have bees, by law, they do not have to stop spraying. And I know that, again, this can be very, very frustrating, but please remember that, these individuals are hired there to do a job. And I also think it's important, if you are a beekeeper, to kind of have a relationship with your neighbors if you can. If you already have a good relationship, that's wonderful. To say, hey, I wanted to let you know I have bees here. I'm happy to give you some honey if I can this year. And if possible, could we talk about the way that you manage vegetation? I think that, a lot of people are going to want to achieve that perfect lawn, or they might want to spend time outdoors, and it is their property, it's their right to do so. So we all kind of have to work together there. But if, let's say, you contact a company and you go up to the guy and you say, hey, I really have, these bees here and I'm really, really worried about it, and they're not being very respectful, and you feel like, they're almost kind of spraying your property on purpose, or they're spraying something that they shouldn't be spraying, please contact us, because we're here to, get somebody out there to deal with it for you. We can definitely be that middleman. The other thing that I hear really, really often is that the utility companies are spraying the right-of-way, and that's my property. By North Carolina pesticide law, the utility companies are allocated up to 15 feet on either side of a power line to apply pesticides. So that's a total of a 30-foot right-of-way. And one thing that's important to consider here is that if, let's say, you contact your power company like Duke Energy, for example, a lot of these companies have a no spray list where they will actually allow you as the customer to manage the vegetation in the right of way, which is really cool. And the biggest thing is, they don't want those hardwood plants to grow up into those power lines. So as long as you're managing it, then, they actually won't have the utility company come out. Now, this isn't surefire. Contacting your utility company is very important here, but they do also, have the ability for you to purchase signs from them that say, like, this is a no spray area. But I will say that when I was an inspector this last few years, there were quite a few times where we were called out to someone's property and I did bust out the measurement tape. So it does happen where, if, let's say, they do actually spray outside of that 15-foot right-of-way, that is drift onto your property, and that is actually illegal. So that's one place where, you do kind of have a limit there. The next thing that I see quite often is, my bees are on field watch, so they can't spray near my house, or they have to notify me. Unfortunately, this program is not a no spray list. This is here as a way to kind of bridge that communication gap between our pesticide applicators and between, the beekeeper. It's really important that these companies actually participate in order to make sure that they're able to notify you. And I will say that this is something that I get a lot of questions about: is notification required in North Carolina? No, it is not. For some specific instances, for example, if, let's say, you live next to a farm and you wanted to go onto that, row crop area, there might be I see some people might be interested in this on here, but there might actually be, we call it a re-entry interval, which is basically like we kind of sanction off part of the field because a pesticide has been sprayed. So in that situation, notification is required for people who are going to be going into that area. So for example, pesticide handlers or farm workers. We also do have notification for aerial spray applications. So if there's going to be a aerial pesticide application in your area and your beehive is on field watch, they have to notify you within I believe, a mile of that site that they're spraying. So that's another good reason to definitely put your hives on field watch. In terms of just like our normal landscapers, they are not required to notify anybody. It actually more has to do with the contract that they have for service between the person who hired them and, whichever type of company it is. Now, I will say we get a lot of calls about, hey, my HOA had hired this person to come in and spray. Talk to your HOA about it. Unfortunately, our division is there to regulate pesticides. We can't really discuss the contracts between an HOA and the spray applicator. So it's something to kind of, talk to people about. I will also say that it's going to look good if you're going to HOA or somebody that's kind of like making decisions for the neighborhood. If you've maybe discussed it with your neighbors first, and then you can all say, hey, here, this is how we feel. We'd like to come together with this information and require that the landscaper notify us in the future if they're going to spray the lawns, things like that. So moving on here to some of the things that are actually facts that I hear pretty often. So they are applying pesticides and it's a very windy day. They have to stop. It depends on the situation. This one is kind of tricky. We actually base a lot of our laws on the pesticide label. Some of you that are familiar with pesticides will see that on the back of each container, there's always going to be a pesticide label. This is the place where you can find environmental hazards, you can find your personal protective equipment information, and you can also find rates and places you're not supposed to apply the pesticide, things like this. Anytime somebody uses a pesticide, whether they're a homeowner or a landscape applicator, they have to follow the label. It is law that they follow the label. As we say in a lot of our talks to landscape applicators and farmers, the label is the law. That being said, a lot of our pesticide labels will actually have a certain miles per hour that people are not supposed to be spraying in. So for example, a lot of herbicide labels will say cannot be sprayed in over 10 mile per hour winds. And it's all specific to each label. And so it's really specific to what chemical it is that they're using. But that being said, drift is illegal within our state. So if it turns out that they're spraying in really high winds, there's really high wind gusts, then they drift onto your property, we can, of course, initiate an investigation and come out there and say, you know, hey, this is illegal. You can't be drifting onto somebody else's property. This also goes for homeowners as well. I'm not really going to get into that too much here because that's a whole different discussion. But yeah, any drift onto your property that is outside of the right of way and is truly on your property is illegal. So, you know, do make sure to contact us if you think that somebody has drifted onto your property. I kind of got into this one. They sprayed my property without my permission. That's illegal. That is true. You would be surprised how many calls we get where actually a landscape company has come out and sprayed the wrong property. A lot of times these folks that are spraying might be new. They might be using a GPS system that took them to the wrong address. It does happen sometimes. I'm glad that it doesn't have to happen more often, but if, let's say, you know, you didn't even order a pesticide application at your house and for some reason somebody came and sprayed, definitely call us because that is in fact illegal. So yeah, please let us know. And then finally, the last one is pesticide applicators cannot spray blooming flower forage or flowers. This is a fact. They should not be spraying anywhere that bees are actively foraging. They should not be spraying certain pesticides on blooming flowers at all, really. So, you know, that's again something that's based on the pesticide label, like we talked about. There's going to be label statements that says prohibited application on blooming flower forage, things like that. But if, let's say, you do have a situation where you are seeing somebody spray onto blooming flowers, go ahead and contact us. You can call my direct line. Feel free to take a photo if you can. I think the biggest drive home that I would love to come out of this presentation is that, you know, we are there to help you. I hear all too often about beekeepers running up to pesticide applicators, very, very angry and upset, and getting into really bad fights with them. You know, that is not what we want, of course. If you ever have a concern, please feel free to contact me and we can kind of talk about what your rights are. And we can also talk about, you know, what is acceptable for those applicators to be doing. So yeah, and of course, you know, any applicators that are on this presentation, please be respectful of beekeepers. It's really important. And beyond that, you know, they're out there to kind of do a job. And so we got to respect that they are out there to do a job and that they've been hired to do that. So yeah, it's all about cooperation. Another thing, and I will say at this point that I do apologize because my presentation does not have a lot of pictures. It's a lot of words. So another thing that I hear really, really often is, common violations. Where do they come from in the law? This is something that is not going to be very interesting to most people, but this is what I do a lot on a daily basis, is kind of trying to figure out, if we get a complaint call, what violation is going to be kind of triggered by that complaint. There are occasions where I will have, beekeepers or homeowners say, I would like to cite the law to somebody. Well, if you have said that, this is for you. So we have two places where our laws come from. We have the North Carolina Pesticide Law of 1971, specifically Article 52. And then we also have the North Carolina Administrative Code, Title II, which is through our Department of Agriculture, specifically Chapter 9 under Food and Drug Protection Division, Subchapter 9L. This is the pesticide sections regulations. I would say, majority of our laws are going to come, or sort of our regulations, I guess in this case, come from that Subchapter 9L, but we do also have a few that actually come from the Pesticide Law of 1971. For example, if somebody has sprayed blooming flower forage within our law, that's categorized under miscellaneous prohibited acts, it shall be unlawful for any person to use a pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. Again, this is something where we will view the label and we'll just, kind of pick it apart. We might even take a highlighter to it and say, what on this label has somebody violated. Beyond that, application to the wrong property. This has to do specifically from a portion of the law that deals with pesticide licenses. And it reads, the board may suspend, modify, or revoke a license issued under this part if it finds the applicant or licensee or his employee has committed any of the following acts, each of which is declared to be a violation of this part. And this would be operated in a faulty, careless, or negligent manner. If, let's say, somebody accidentally sprays the wrong property, pretty consistently negligent behavior, and it may have been an accident, of course, but this is kind of the violation that it falls under. We also have pesticide drift. Initially, we'll kind of look at that label. We'll see if the label has any type of language that prohibits pesticide drift. Most of them do, especially for herbicides and also for our insecticides. And then beyond that, we also have a specific regulation that comes from our regulations for drift control. So that should be, no person shall apply a pesticide under such conditions that drift from a pesticide particles or vapors result in adverse effect. So there you have it. That's kind of the specific part of the law that we draw from in terms of our investigations when we're actually coming to settlement with people who have violated the law. I would say it would probably be a little bit complicated to cite this law to somebody, but if you wanted to have a conversation and kind of talk about how these laws actually play out in real time in specific instances, please call me and we can talk a little bit about it. So, you think you have a bee kill. What should you do? What do you consider? What's going on here? So the first thing is, if let's say you're seeing dead bees in front of your hives or inside of your hives, the first thing you want to do is report it to our division or to the apiary section, which is a part of the plant industry division. We will work together and kind of come out. We'll send out an inspector. Apiary division will send out an inspector, and we'll actually go ahead and look at the hive. The next thing to do is also consider what other types of pests might already exist within the hive. So it's possible that, some colonies may collapse due to varroa mites, robbing, starvation, nosema, foul brood, wax moth, small hive beetles, issues with the queen. We see pretty much all different types of things out in the field. So it can be a really wide range of things, and our apiary inspectors are going to be kind of our experts here. Mostly, our pesticide inspectors aren't really going to be making that kind of decision. It's going to be our apiary inspectors, so they'll actually open up the hive and take a look once they're on site with you. Beyond that, we want to consider what type of application was made. Was it an application, for example, to mosquitoes where they directly applied an insecticide that could potentially harm bees? Not to say that all mosquito applications do, it just depends on what chemical it is that they're using. And beyond that, is it an application that's made to plants? So it could be that, let's say somebody sprayed an herbicide on these plants that is particularly toxic to bees, and the bees foraged on that and then took it back to the hive, and then we kind of had an issue there. So it's always important to consider the type of application. That being said, we will still come out if you didn't even see any pesticides applied at all. So we will still, in that case, come out and check it out too. Just, give us a call and we can look into it. We always want to make sure that we're out there as soon as possible so that we can get the best samples for the case. Inspectors will take honey samples, wax, pollen. We'll actually take the dead bees most of the time, in addition to soil and water samples if there was a nearby application. And beyond that, make sure that you're familiar with the symptoms of pesticide exposure. I'm going to show you a video within this next slide, but it's a lot of twitching. It almost looks like somebody phrased it as the bee break dance. So if you ever see a lot of twitching, jumpy movement, and ultimately a lot of dead bees, this is kind of a symptom of pesticide exposure. There's a few other ones too, but if you're questioning it, you can contact the apiary division or our division. So we're going to watch a video here, and I hope that it works for you, but this is a great video that shows classic symptoms of pesticide exposure. So you'll see here that the bees are a little bit twitchy, and beyond that, they seem to be a little bit confused, and ultimately there's quite a few dead bees. And it's fairly easy to tell, and I really hope that the quality is good enough that you can kind of see it, but it's a lot of twitchiness, and then a lot of just almost lethargy, confusion, things like that. Oops, we restarted it there for a second. Okay, so moving on a little bit. I'm sure most of you are familiar with integrated pest management, which is, kind of a combination of different tactics in order to deal with pests. These could be insect pests, weed pests, whatever it is that is in your situation that is kind of leading to undesirable results. If you are going to apply a pesticide, it is very important to remember some specific things here. And I know that a lot of people on this call probably are anti-pesticide, but even to consider if you're applying organic pesticides, make sure that you are always really paying attention to what it is that you apply. Make sure first and foremost that the active ingredient of what you're going to apply has a low toxicity rating to bees. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you this thing which is called the active ingredient traffic light, where our environmental toxicologist, John Allran, actually went through and rated every single active ingredient and how toxic they are to pollinators. So that's an amazing resource to have. Always make sure that you're wearing personal protective equipment and you follow label directions. I had somebody call me just today and they had talked to me about how they applied an insecticide to some cucumbers on their property. She kind of described to me that she came back the next day and all of her plants were brown. And I asked her if she had followed the label on the back and asked her if she followed the label right. And she didn't know what a pesticide label was. I explained it to her, and it turns out that instead of mixing the product with water, she actually just dumped the dry product all over her plants. So of course she kind of saw some phytotoxicity there. So please make sure that you familiarize yourself with the label rates and the directions. Beyond that, like we mentioned earlier, avoid spraying blooming flower forage. So anywhere that bees might be going to get pollen, don't spray those areas. It could be, our really pretty ornamental plants. It could even be, the understory clover, things like that. Communicate with your neighbors about your beehives and about their landscape applications. Like I mentioned earlier, it's important to be respectful of what they choose to do on their property, but make sure that they know that your bees are there. And then you can always, of course, sign up for registries like Field Watch and contact our division if you think you have a bee kill. So This next thing is something that we do not commonly talk about, but I find it to be incredibly important. What a lot of people don't realize or they don't really think about when they are getting into beekeeping is that there are actually quite a few pesticide applications that people will make to their hives in order to, avoid any hive pests. So, for example, we have Apiguard and a lot of other good approved treatments that will work really well that have been EPA approved. They give you the correct label rate, and this is for a suite of all different issues: varroa mites, wax moth, small hive beetle. However, one thing that we see quite often is that people will use sort of home remedies to avoid actually paying for registered pesticide products for their beehives. Not only is this illegal, but this can also cause unwanted pesticide residue in your honey. It's a very bad idea. Even at the state beekeepers meeting, we see individuals selling wood bleach. For those of you that do not know, wood bleach, the active ingredient is oxalic acid. This is something that is used in varroa mite treatments. It's quite frustrating because wood bleach is not approved to be used as a pesticide in a beehive. Please do not put it in your beehive. It can be incredibly harmful to your bees and actually cause your bees to die. But beyond that, it's very illegal and again can cause wood bleach residue in your honey, which is not something that we want. Other things that I've heard of in the past, fipronil being used in CD cases as again an insect pest treatment. This would be, for example, if somebody went to the store and they got like frontline Advantix or some type of a flea or tick treatment, and they actually just squeeze that out into a cassette or CD case and they put that in their hive. The main takeaway here is please do not use any pesticides that are not registered for use in beehives as registered or as hive treatments. This is not a good idea. It is not safe and it is very illegal. Beyond that, if let's say you are going to be treating your hives, please follow the label instructions and make sure to wear gloves while you're treating because we don't want it to get on you and make you sick or anything like that. So this next thing is the thing I was telling you that our environmental toxicologist made. This has to be the coolest thing I've ever seen come out of our division. I just think it's awesome and incredibly helpful. So what this is the pesticide toxicity to bees traffic light. He went through and he actually broke down every active ingredient. For those of you that don't know, an active ingredient of a pesticide is the thing that actually does the killing power within the pesticide. Most of the times there's an active ingredient and then there's also several inert ingredients in a pesticides. These could be surfactants, carriers, or just things that are, added to that active ingredient to improve the formulation. So this is going to be looking at each of those active ingredients. Going through just some that I would like to point out to you, and we'll get to that on the next slide, but it's easy to read. He made the red ones that are highly toxic to bees, red. Beyond that, moderately toxic, we have the yellow, and then past that we have green. So I went through and I just kind of took some sections of things that we see pretty commonly. So bifenthrin is probably the most common active ingredient that's used in mosquito applications. I'd say about 90% of the time, if you're out there spraying for mosquitoes, it's probably going to be a bifenthrin product. As you can see, this is an insecticide and it's highly toxic to bees. Like I mentioned earlier, just because someone is making a mosquito application doesn't mean that they're applying bifenthrin, but I would say most of the time it probably is. We also have imidacloprid, which is a commonly used fungicide. It's something that we see pretty often. Lindane, malathion, permethrin, pyrethrins, spinosad, these are all commonly used insecticides. Things that are intended to kill insects, of course, bees are an insect, and kind of the rule of thumb is that if something has a similar biological process to the thing that you're attempting to kill, it will probably be toxic to that, beneficial insect that you want. One thing that I like to point out here is that spinosad is often advertised as an organic product, and it's really a trusted product in a lot of organic gardening situations. That being said, it is still highly toxic to bees. So just because something's organic does not mean that it's non-toxic. If you ever have any questions, by the way, if you're like at the grocery store, excuse me, the hardware store, I guess, and kind of looking at stuff and you're not really sure, you can always call our division or call your extension agents and we can help you out with that. One thing that is brought up a lot, you'll notice that some of our herbicides, which are, those pesticides that are formulated to kill weeds, are going to be in sort of our relatively non-toxic category. This even includes glyphosate. I know that there's a lot in the media about glyphosate being a very toxic compound, but in terms of its overall health to pollinators, it's actually relatively non-toxic based off of the research that our environmental toxicologists did. Beyond that, I've added a few other ones as well. One that is another good one to point out here is Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT, another one that's commonly used as an insecticide in organic gardening. This is actually relatively non-toxic to bees, so this would be a bit of a safer insecticide use. And it's more specifically good for our Lepidopteran or like butterfly moth type species of critters, caterpillars. Last thing I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, and I really hope that most of you are already on FieldWatch, is FieldWatch. This is a program that allows beekeepers to set up and map out their hives, and then pesticide applicators can log on and actually see where all of these hives are, contact the beekeepers, and work together to provide better stewardship. We have quite a few resources for individuals that might be interested in learning a little bit more about how to communicate with different groups of people that work with bees. So we have Knowing Your Beekeeper for farmers. We also have Know Your Farmer for beekeepers, Knowing Your Beekeeper for landscapers, etc. We also have some information here for homeowners. That's kind of the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't go too much over in time. But yeah, one final thing, if you tuned in today to this broadcast to receive pesticide applicator credit, go ahead and put your full name, including your middle initial, as well as your pesticide applicator's license in our chat box right now, and we'll make sure that you receive credit for this broadcast. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sydney. So we have one question, and that's about all we have time for so that we can get everybody out of here. It's 5:04 and we don't want to keep anybody any longer. But the question is, where can I get a copy of the toxicity traffic light chart?
Oh, I'm very glad that you asked that. So if you go onto our department's website, you'll be able to just look up in the general search bar, just look up traffic light and it will come up. So that's the easiest way to find it.
Okay. All right, I lied. So one more question. Is the consumer support material available online or in hard copy?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that in terms of consumer support material. In terms of what I had just shown here, and I'm not sure if you can still see, but this one is available hard copy, and we will have it a lot of times at our state fairs and things like that.
Okay. Do you want to put the screen back up?
Sure.
All right. So I'm going to put my screen back on. I wish I could see everybody out there, but here is the contact information for all of our speakers today. If you have any lingering questions or you just want to find out a little bit more about their expertise. And I've also thrown out my contact information if you want to find out anything else about our group, North Carolina Pollinator Conservation Alliance. I wanted to say extra thank you to all of our speakers. This is our first attempt at doing anything like this, so it was a little bit bumpy, but we got through it, and hopefully everybody learned something and got something out of this. If you want more information about our organization, you can go check out our website, ncpollinatoralliance.org. We're also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And like I said, if you have any lingering questions, please feel free to shoot any of us an email and we'll answer it. Like I mentioned at the beginning of all this, we're going to send out a list of resources and answer any questions that we didn't get a chance to respond to. Although I think that we were able to answer most of the questions while the speakers were talking. If any of the panelists of ourselves, if we could, we are answering the questions. But like I said, we'll send out another email with some extra resources as well. So again, thank you all for joining. We really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll do some more webinars like this. If you have any suggestions of other webinars you'd like to see, certainly let us know. But if not, then have a great afternoon. Thanks so much.